Alright, I'm doing my project on the race riots in 1919 in Chicago. It's also known as Red Summer. I chose this topic because I feel like it relates to things that we talked about in class relating to collective violence, but also the two units where we discussed the Black Lives Matter movement with Michael Brown and also just the civil rights movement in general. Um, yeah. So kind of just starting out, kind of how it began was a black teenager. His name was Eugene Williams. He died at Lake Michigan because he was stoned to death by other white kids. Also, he was a teenager, so he was killed by other children because he violated an unofficial segregation rule. So we kind of just see how segregation was still super prominent during this time. So clearly he stepped over those boundaries by going to this lake and he was stoned to death. So after this had happened, we see kind of a week of rioting that kind of followed that, in which 23 black people died and 15 white people died. Over 500 people were injured, and 1,000 black families lost their homes. This was also due to the fact that the police officers refused to arrest the man that was, in charge of the incident and kind of incited it, which we see a really great relation to like current police brutality incidences. So just looking at underlying causes that contributes to the racial tension and just specifically segregation. Um, we see the migration of, African Americans to northern cities, specifically during World War One. And after World War One, people, began returning from war and they realized that their jobs were taken. They no longer had a job. And that just created a lot of tension and a lot of hatred towards these African Americans that basically took their jobs, which we see as an excuse a lot when we look at, oppressed groups, specifically in the United States, But I also do want to acknowledge that the KKK had also gained prominence again during this time period. Um, and it was kind of just a period of time where like whites and African Americans were pitted against each other with job competition and just an increase in African Americans in like the overall population. Um, so yeah, and then looking at the aftermath, zoning laws were discussed, restrictions on work were discussed. There was also the Chicago Commission on Race Relations that was formed to kind of find the root causes and combat them, even though improvement was slow, which we see a lot of empty promises like this even today. So the main reason why I chose this topic is because I really like how intertwined it is with what we talked about in class. So, obviously we learned about the Michael Brown case, and this is just a picture of like Ferguson and the memorial. And we see similarities in the fact that, there was no criminal charges against the officer involved in that case. Um, we've seen a lot of other examples of police brutality, with George Floyd, Eric Gardner, Trayvon Martin, and there's just a lot of similarities. And this happened in 1919, so we see that like this is still prevalent to today, and there hasn't been much change. Um, but I wanted to really talk about the parallels of, how we talked about the Michael Brown case and civil rights movement and how this intertwines with that. Relating specifically to instances of collective violence that we talked about in class and the readings that we had discussed, I just want to kind of compare to what some of the people that we talked about in class said about collective violence. Specifically, Tilly kind of addresses violence within the state and how that kind of diminishes violence abroad. So it's almost like a distraction, which we see here. Um, and even though individual countries and governments, push for domestic peace, so in this situation, obviously the government is going to say, peace, peace, we want peace, we want to stay calm. They're going to push for, they're going to encourage violence on other countries around the world. So it's just sort of like a hypocritical stance because that violence is being directed towards them right now. We see a parallel between rich and Western countries who don't really pay much attention to wars. So specifically in this case, we see white people don't pay attention much to racism, oppression, and like segregation because it didn't affect them. It wasn't negatively affecting them, which is similar to how Western countries view other violence across the world. There's also like an us-them boundary that we see, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but it's kind of just like the pitting against, black and white. And just violence also increases with lack of certainty, which we see Tilly talk about. Moving on to Hedges, he really talks about the mythic backing of war. And I feel like that's really prominent in, this case, even the Michael Brown case, civil rights movement. Like media plays a really big role in these because they have an agenda and they spread, propaganda and whatever is appealing to, an individual sense of self. And just kind of spreading of misinformation. They pick and choose what they want to share with the world, which we saw in the films that we watched in the later half of the semester. And then we kind of see how war or violence is almost like an addiction. The unity and the purpose behind it creates an addiction that just creates a continuous cycle. And we also see how Hedges discusses, demonizing the enemy. It becomes very easy to inflict violence onto someone when you picture them as evil and demon and kind of separate the humanity from them. It becomes easier. So like we see, it's easier for white people to inflict violence and pain onto African Americans, specifically during the time of segregation, because they viewed them as less than human. So that's kind of an example of why like so many black families were affected by this. Like 1,000 black homes were destroyed, more black lives were lost. It's easier to inflict violence when you demonize the enemy, which we see in war. We also see how nationalism plays a role, which also kind of correlates into, colonization, which we're going to talk about with Fanon, but nationalism plays a really large role in this because I feel like white people use that as an excuse to kind of preserve, the whiteness in America. So we see that. And looking at Fanon, he has one of like the most relatable, points that relate to, Red Summer. He talks about the rich and the white and the parallels to colonization. So we really see how slavery, the Civil War, and segregation all relates back to colonization. Slavery began with that main idea of colonization. And all of that is stemming into how law enforcement now currently treats Black Americans, which we see in these cases of police brutality, but also how, white people were inflicting pain, lynchings, and just the KKK was really involved in the terrorization of Black Americans. We can also talk about, how this kind of eases the tasks of law enforcement. So, these individuals who stoned this young boy to death eased, the job of law enforcement. Instead of calling law enforcement to remove him, they just took it into their own hands, which eases their job, and also they did not have to charge them because of an unofficial law. Capitalism also rewards neutrality, so we see how capitalism plays a really large role in racism, which is kind of another conversation. And there's a lot of similarities with Marx and class consciousness and how, Black and white people are pitted against each other to prevent, the working class rising up to fight against the real issues. Instead, they fight each other, which keeps a distraction from root causes of capitalism, colonization, and the government. I also want to preface how bad I am with technology, so if this is rough, I'm really sorry. I'm trying to get all the information that I can down, but Overall, we see the death of Eugene Williams as kind of a symbolism for what's to come later in the future with police brutality and just the treatment of Black Americans in the United States, which we see parallels with what we talked about in class relating to the civil rights movement, but also the instances of violence that happened in Ferguson with Michael Brown. We just see the correlations between, Tilly, Hedges, and Fannin and the points that they made with colonization and mythic backing of wars with the media, just violence abroad and around the globe, and how that all contributes to really the way law enforcement handle these situations, but also how the KKK contributed to how white Americans treated Black Americans during this time, but also still today, and how this is a really good starting point for just rioting and kind of setting an example, which we see in the future with other forms of violence, rather earlier forms of nonviolence that we. So it's just kind of a parallel between, the violence and the nonviolence. This was an example of collective violence, which I think is a great example and stepping stone for the use of collective violence in civil rights movements versus the previous nonviolent approach.